What does it mean to own countless watches, yet never truly own a moment of your life? How does a strange man connect each of his watches to a tragic event in his past? In this gripping tale by Arthur Conan Doyle, the man with the watches tells the story of a mysterious man whose collection of timepieces hides more than just time. What secrets do these watches reveal about his past? Discover the reimagined English version only on Classic Storytime Hub.
The Rugby Mystery. The name alone still stirs whispers. It was a case that captivated the public back in the spring of 1892. The headlines, the speculation, the debates, they all seemed to reach their peak at a time when the news world was desperate for something, anything to grab attention. In truth, it probably didn't deserve as much as it got, yet it was that strange cocktail of whimsy and tragedy that always intrigues the public. But as the weeks dragged on with no real answers, interest began to fade. Investigations went nowhere, explanations eluded the brightest minds, and eventually the story sank into the shadows. Just another inexplicable crime added to the cold, dark files of history. That is, until recently. A new letter has surfaced, one whose authenticity seems beyond question, and with it, a fresh light has been cast on the mystery. Before I share its contents, however, let's rewind a little. Let me remind you of the strange events that sparked it all, the strange, unsettling facts that set the stage. March 18th, 1892. 5 o'clock in the evening. A storm was sweeping through the streets as a train pulled away from Euston Station, bound for Manchester. It was the kind of night you'd expect to keep most people indoors, but the train was far from empty. It was a favorite route for business people, those Manchester traders who lived for efficiency. 4 hours and 20 minutes. That's all it took, with just 3 stops along the way. The weather, however, was not friendly. Torrential rain, fierce winds, the kind of weather that makes you think twice before stepping outside. But the train was packed. In spite of the storm, the platform was alive with last-minute commuters. On board was a man who had worked for the company for 22 years without a single blemish or complaint, a seasoned veteran, one could say. His name was John Palmer, the train guard. His hand was raised, ready to signal the engine driver. The station clock had just chimed 5. Then a sudden movement caught his eye. He paused. 2 figures were sprinting down the platform, faces strained, their coats whipping in the wind. They weren't supposed to be there, at least not now. The train was almost ready to depart. The first of the 2 figures was a strikingly tall man. His overcoat, a long, dark piece with a fur-collared edge, looked heavy, almost protective against the brutal March wind. With his collar turned high to shield his neck from the cold, he moved with purpose, his footsteps purposeful but quick. The guard, John Palmer, had only a moment to observe him, but he could tell this was a man who had aged with grace. Late 50s, perhaps, but still with a remarkable vitality that seemed to defy his years. In his hand he carried a brown leather Gladstone bag, well worn from use but undeniably sturdy. Next to him a woman walked. She matched him in stature and then some. She moved with a brisk energy that left her companion slightly behind. Her long fawn-colored cloak billowed as she walked, the dark veil on her face hiding most of her features. Only her sharp eyes could be seen, scanning the world around her as she moved. They could have easily been mistaken for father and daughter, the 2 of them, a mismatched pair on a strange errand. They walked swiftly, not pausing to engage with anyone, only glancing at the windows of the train carriages as they passed. It wasn't until the pair reached the end of the platform that Palmer caught up with them. "Move it, sir, the train's about to leave," he called out, his voice cutting through the thick air. The tall man responded with a single word: "First class." Palmer wasted no time. He grabbed the nearest door handle and swung it open. Inside sat a small man, late 30s, early 40s, his sharp face half hidden by the thick smoke of his cigar. There was something about him, something that stuck in Palmer's mind. He was hard to forget. Maybe it was the way his eyes darted quickly, constantly scanning the surroundings. When the tall man reached the carriage door, he hesitated, his foot hovering just above the step. His eyes scanned the compartment with a critical glance. "This is a smoking compartment. The lady doesn't like smoke," he said, looking directly at Palmer. "Right then, no problem," Palmer replied, slightly flustered. He quickly slammed the smoking compartment door shut, swung open the next, empty, and ushered the two travelers inside. As the train's wheels began to turn, Palmer blew his whistle. The train jerked forward, and for a moment the world outside rushed by in a blur. The man with the cigar was already leaning out the window of his compartment, calling something out to Palmer, but the words were lost in the chaos of the train's departure. Palmer climbed into the guard's van, shook the moment off, and tried to forget it. Another day, another train. But there was something strange in the air that evening, something that had been set into motion. 12 minutes. That's all it took for the mystery to take a darker turn. By the time the train reached Williston Junction, the storm outside had only grown more violent, its howling winds battering the windows. The train slowed, stopped, and the doors clicked open for a brief pause. No one boarded, no one left. At least that's what the ticket checks confirmed. The station was eerily still. Not a single passenger disembarked onto the slick platform. Yet in those moments, something strange lingered in the air. The train resumed its journey at 5:14 p.m., the rhythmic clatter of the tracks filling the silence. It wasn't until Rugby, just before 6:90 p.m., that the first signs of something truly disturbing became apparent. The first-class carriage door was wide open. At first glance, it seemed like a trivial oversight, a door that hadn't been properly shut. But the inspection that followed uncovered something far more unsettling. Inside, the compartment where the short, ruddy-faced man with the black beard had sat was now completely empty. The air still smelled faintly of tobacco, the half-smoked cigar discarded on the floor. But that was it. No trace of the man, no sign of his belongings. The door to the carriage was locked tight. Next, the guards turned their attention to the compartment where the tall man with the astrakhan collar and the veiled lady had been. Gone. No sign of them either. And then there was the floor. Lying there as though forgotten by time itself was a young man, sharply dressed, his appearance elegant and poised. He was in an unnatural position, knees pulled up, his head resting against the far door, elbows propped on the seats beside him. But the thing that stood out most was the blood that stained the floor beneath him. A single bullet wound in his heart. It was instant. He hadn't struggled. He hadn't even had time to react. Who was he? How had he gotten on board? Where was his ticket? And more disturbingly, who had killed him? No identification, no ticket, no personal effects of any kind. His linen was plain, and nothing in his pockets hinted at his identity. The unanswered questions piled up. What had happened to the 3 passengers who had boarded at Williston? And who was this young man, whose death was as much a mystery as the disappearance of the others? The train had left Williston with 3, but somewhere between the journey, it had lost all of them. It's true that nothing in the young man's pockets could point to his identity, nothing, that is, except for 6 gold watches. Yes, you read that correctly, 6. They were all tucked away in different pockets of his clothes, 3 in his waistcoat, 1 in the ticket pocket, 1 in his breast pocket, and the last, a small, highly ornamental piece strapped to his left wrist. A peculiar detail, wouldn't you say? At first, the most obvious explanation seemed to be that the man was a thief, a pickpocket perhaps, who had stolen these watches. But that theory quickly fell apart when it was realized that all 6 watches were American-made, an unusual rarity in England at the time. The watches were of a type that didn't appear in local shops. 3 bore the unmistakable mark of the Rochester Watchmaking Company. One was made by Mason of Elmira. Another was unmarked, its origins shrouded in mystery. And the smallest one, carefully set in a leather strap, was an exquisitely jeweled piece bearing the name Tiffany of New York. That, however, was just the beginning of the strange discoveries. The young man's pockets also held a few curious items: an ivory-handled knife with a corkscrew, crafted by Rogers of Sheffield, a small circular mirror barely an inch in diameter, a readmission slip to the Lyceum Theater, seemingly out of place in such a grim scene, a silver box full of Vesta matches, a brown leather cigar case containing 2 cheroots, and, perhaps most oddly, £2 14 shillings in cash. Robbery was clearly not the motive behind his death. There was no sign that the watches had been stolen or that he had been targeted for his wealth. In fact, his personal effects painted a picture of a man who didn't seem to fit the profile of a thief at all. His clothes were new, impeccably clean, with no tailor's mark anywhere to be found. His features were delicate, young, smooth-cheeked. One of his front teeth was conspicuously filled with gold, an odd and striking detail. A man of mystery, without a name, and with no clear reason for his presence on the train or for the violence that had claimed his life. When the tragedy was discovered, an immediate investigation was launched. Every passenger's ticket was checked and a head count was made. The result? Only 3 tickets were unaccounted for, those belonging to the 3 missing passengers. The express was allowed to continue its journey, but a new guard was dispatched, and John Palmer was detained as a witness at Rugby. Meanwhile, the carriage that housed the 2 compartments in question was uncoupled and moved to a sidetrack, quarantined as part of the investigation. The mystery was far from over. When Inspector Vane of Scotland Yard and Mr. Henderson, a railway detective, arrived, the investigation took a more serious turn. The scene was now under intense scrutiny, and the questions were mounting. It was clear that a crime had been committed, but the details were murky. The victim, the young man whose life had been so suddenly and violently taken, had been shot. A small bullet wound, probably from a small pistol or revolver. There were no signs of close contact, no scorching of the clothes to suggest the shot had been fired at point-blank range. But perhaps the most unsettling discovery? No weapon was found in the compartment. This ruled out any possibility of suicide. The bullet had not come from the victim himself. Equally perplexing was the absence of the brown leather bag the guard had seen the tall man carrying earlier. The bag had vanished without a trace. The only item left behind was a lady's parasol, casually resting on the rack above. Nothing else to suggest where the passengers had gone or what had happened to them. The mystery deepened. How had 3 passengers, 2 of them gone without a trace, disappeared? More baffling still, how had a new passenger gotten on board during the unbroken stretch between Willesden and Rugby? This set the public on fire. Speculation ran wild across London. The question of how such a thing could happen without anyone noticing captured the public's imagination. How could anyone vanish in plain sight? And how had the new arrival slipped into the train unnoticed? At the inquest, John Palmer, the guard, offered some clues that would later prove significant. He recalled a particular spot between Tring and Cheddington, a section of the line that had been under repairs. During this time, the train had slowed down to no more than 10 or 8 miles per hour. This slow pace, Palmer explained, would have made it possible for someone to jump from the train without suffering serious injury. But here's the thing, the timing was crucial. The gang of platelayers working there that day had seen nothing. They were standing between the rails, as was their habit, but the carriage door was on the far side, too far for them to see clearly. And by this time the darkness was closing in. If someone had made a leap for it, they could have been swallowed up by the night, hidden from view by a steep embankment that would have shielded them from the workers' gaze. It was a plausible theory, and yet it raised more questions than it answered.
The guard, John Palmer, was questioned further. He spoke of the flurry of movement on the platform at Willesden Junction. Despite the fact that no one had boarded or disembarked from the train there, he suggested that passengers might have switched compartments unnoticed. It wasn't unusual for someone to finish their cigar in a smoking carriage and then move to a more comfortable, smoke-free section. The half-smoked cigar, lying carelessly on the floor, seemed to support this theory. If the man with the black beard had done just that at Willesden, he would likely have stepped into the nearest compartment, right into the company of the two other passengers. A simple move. But then what? How had things escalated to murder? The first part of the story made sense, but the second stage, the turning point, remained a complete mystery. Neither the guard nor the detectives could make sense of it. The experienced officers were left with nothing but confusion. A thorough search was conducted along the train route between Willesden and Rugby, and it was here, near Tring, that a small pocket testament was discovered at the foot of the embankment. It was old, worn down, its leather cover cracked and tattered. Printed by the Bible Society of London, it was a humble object. But there was something more. Inside, on the flyleaf, an inscription caught the eye. From John to Alice, January 13th, 1856. Underneath, another entry, James, July 4th, 1859. And yet another, Edward, November 1st, 1869, all written in the same hand. The detective's curiosity piqued. Was this book connected to the tragedy? Was it the key to understanding the puzzle? The pocket testament was the only clue found, if it could even be called that. And yet, despite its significance, it brought no answers. The coroner's verdict, a heartless murder by a person or persons unknown, was the final word. A case closed, but only in the official sense. As expected, the case spiraled into speculation. The press, both in England and America, went into overdrive. Theories of every kind flooded the papers, some clever, some downright absurd. Conspiracy theories flourished, but none could provide anything solid enough to move the investigation forward. The mystery, it seemed, was destined to remain unsolved. The discovery of the American-made watches and the curious detail of the gold filling in the victim's front tooth quickly led some to speculate that the deceased might have been an American citizen. However, his clothes, his linen, his boots, and his overall attire were clearly of British manufacture. This raised more questions than it answered. Was he truly an American? Or was he simply caught in a web that crossed international borders? Theories began to circulate. Some suggested that the man had been concealed under the seat, a hidden witness who had overheard something, perhaps something incriminating, and that his death had been a cold-blooded execution by his fellow passengers. This idea, when paired with the shadowy images of anarchists or secret societies, seemed to fit the bill. After all, it was well known that women were often involved in such radical movements. But then, a flaw in the theory emerged.
The guard's testimony indicated that the man had been hidden before the others had boarded. How could it be, they asked, that a group of conspirators who had no knowledge of his presence had chosen the exact compartment where the man was concealed? The theory began to fall apart. It also ignored the man in the smoking compartment, whose disappearance was just as perplexing. What could explain that? The police quickly dismissed this theory. While it seemed plausible in theory, there was no evidence to support it, and they were left with no solid leads, no answers. But then, a letter appeared in the Daily Gazette. It was penned by a renowned criminal investigator, a man with a reputation for digging into the most perplexing cases. His hypothesis was one of the few that actually caught the public's attention and stirred some real debate. "Whatever the truth may be," the letter began, "it surely hinges on a bizarre and rare combination of events. So rather than adhering to the usual methods of deduction, we must allow ourselves to postulate, to imagine the events that could have led to such an outcome. In the absence of evidence, we must abandon the analytic approach and instead turn to something more synthetic, a theory that fits the peculiar nature of the crime. The truth, my friends, is likely to be far stranger than we've ever anticipated." This theory, though speculative, carried a certain elegance in its approach, an acceptance that some mysteries simply couldn't be solved by traditional means. And yet, even as the words settled, the case remained an enigma. In simple terms, rather than relying on facts to deduce what happened, we must instead construct a story, a theory that fits the facts, no matter how unusual it may seem. This approach, though speculative, allows us to test the theory as new evidence comes in. If everything fits piece by piece, then we are likely on the right track. With each new detail, our confidence grows, and the probability of truth increases exponentially until the evidence becomes irrefutable. Now, there is one fact, one clue that has not been given the attention it deserves. It involves a local train running between Harrow and King's Langley. This train was scheduled in such a way that it would have been overtaken by the express at the same time the express slowed down due to repairs on the line. At that moment, both trains would have been traveling in the same direction, at a similar speed, and on parallel tracks. Anyone familiar with such circumstances knows how easy it is for passengers on one train to see clearly into the carriages of the other. The express, illuminated by the lamps at Willesden, would have made its carriages visible, glowing brightly under the night. Now, let's reconstruct the events in my theory. Picture this. The young man, the one with the 6 watches, is sitting alone in a compartment of the slow train. His ticket, papers, and gloves are resting on the seat beside him. Perhaps he's an American, maybe even someone with a fragile intellect, easily excitable, an individual who, we might suppose, has developed a bizarre obsession with jewelry. In some cases, such behavior can be an early warning sign of mental instability. As he sits there, watching the carriages of the express, traveling side by side, each moving at the same slow pace, he suddenly spots familiar faces through the glass. There, in the illuminated compartments of the express, are the figures he recognizes: a woman, someone he loves, and a man, one he hates, a man who in turn despises him. This is where the theory takes an interesting turn. What happens next? What does this moment of recognition trigger in the mind of the young man? Could this chance encounter, this unexpected reunion on a moving train, be the spark that ignites the rest of the tragic events? The young man was nothing if not impulsive, a volatile, excitable figure whose emotions governed his every action. Seeing the 2 familiar faces through the window, his mind made a snap decision. Without a second thought, he swung open the door of his compartment, stepped onto the footboard of the local train, and made a daring leap onto the express. The move, although seemingly reckless, wasn't as dangerous as it first appeared. With the trains moving at the same slow speed, it wasn't an impossible feat. He crossed the gap, entered the express, and made his way toward the carriage where the 2 passengers, the woman and the man, were seated. Now, in this confined space, the stage was set for an explosive confrontation. It's easy to imagine the scene. The young man, filled with a mix of jealousy, anger, and possibly even a trace of mania, could have stormed in, demanding an explanation for their presence. If they were also Americans, and it's plausible they were, given the man's possession of a weapon, something rare in England. It's not hard to picture an argument escalating into violence. If our theory about the young man's fragile state of mind holds true, he might have attacked the other man. What followed? The elder man, in self-defense or anger, could have shot the intruder, immediately exiting the compartment with the young woman. This all happened quickly, perhaps so quickly that the slow speed of the train played a crucial role. The woman, in a state of shock or fear, might have jumped off the train herself. 8 miles an hour might not sound like much, but it was enough to give her a chance. We already know with certainty that she did leave the train. Now there's the man in the smoking carriage, the last piece of the puzzle. If our theory up to this point is correct, we can now fit him into the narrative. This man, having witnessed the young man's daring move, must have seen him cross from one train to the other, heard the gunshot, and watched the two fugitives spring out onto the tracks. Realizing that murder had occurred, he must have acted swiftly, jumping off the train in pursuit. But here's the question: why has he never been heard from again? Did he meet his own end during the chase? Or, more likely, did he come to understand that this was no case for a bystander's interference? This remains a mystery, one that we have no clear answers for at this moment. Despite the gaps in the story, I'll acknowledge that the theory has its challenges. There are still questions left unanswered, but for now it fits the events in a way that seems at least plausible, perhaps even inevitable. At first glance, it might seem almost inconceivable that a murderer fleeing the scene would choose to carry a heavy brown leather bag with him. After all, the bag could easily be traced back to him. But I propose that the man knew exactly what he was doing. The bag, though seemingly unnecessary burden, was vital. He knew that if the bag were found, his identity would be revealed. It was, in fact, a deliberate decision to take it with him, knowing full well the consequences. This theory hinges on one crucial point, and I challenge the railway company to investigate thoroughly. Was a ticket left unclaimed on the local train running through Harrow and King's Langley on March 18th? If such a ticket was found, it would confirm my theory. But if not, there's still a possibility that the theory holds, for it's conceivable that the man traveled without a ticket, or that his ticket was lost during the chaos.
In response to this carefully constructed theory, the police and the railway company offered a swift dismissal. First, they confirmed that no unclaimed ticket had been found. Secondly, they argued that the local train and the express could not have run parallel to one another at any point during the journey. Finally, they stated that the local train had been stationary in King's Langley when the express, traveling at 50 miles an hour, flashed past it. And just like that, the most satisfying explanation evaporated, leaving the case once again shrouded in mystery. 5 years passed, and no new theories emerged. But now, finally, we have something, a statement that seems to tie everything together. This new piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of a letter, dated from New York, addressed to the same criminal investigator whose theory had been dismissed all those years ago. The letter, although somewhat cryptic, sheds light on the events that had remained buried for so long. The opening paragraphs are personal and, for now, remain private, but here's the rest. You'll excuse me if I'm not very free with names. There's less reason now than there was 5 years ago when my mother was still living. But for all that, I'd rather cover up our tracks as much as I can. Still, I owe you an explanation. If your theory was wrong, it was a mighty ingenious one nonetheless. I'll have to go back a little so you can understand the whole picture. This new twist is the beginning of what promises to be a much deeper and more personal account. The mystery, it seems, has been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. My family came from Bucks, England, the letter began, the words carefully crafted but full of meaning. We emigrated to the United States in the early 50s and settled in Rochester, New York. My father ran a large dry goods store, and there were only two of us, me, James, and my younger brother, Edward. I was 10 years older than he was, and after our father passed, I took on the role of a father figure for him, more out of necessity than choice. Edward was everything a young man could wish for, bright, energetic, and in many ways the most beautiful soul to ever walk this earth. But there was something fragile about him, something that I couldn't put my finger on. It was like a subtle flaw, a soft spot in his nature. Think of it like mold in cheese. At first, it's just a small imperfection, but then it grows, spreading in ways you can't control. We both saw it, my mother and I, and even though we tried, we couldn't stop it. But my mother, she spoiled him, perhaps more than I could ever understand. And he had a way with people, a charm that meant no one could refuse him. It was like he had everyone wrapped around his finger, and I, the older brother, was the only one trying to keep him in check. Naturally, he hated me for it, but someone had to. Then, as is often the case with those too clever for their own good, Edward found his own way, and it was downhill from there. He ended up in New York City, and in a matter of months, he went from just a wild, reckless young man to one of the most notorious crooks in the city. At first, it was all about fast living. Reckless, yes, but still not criminal. But it didn't take long before things turned darker. He became involved with Sparrow McCoy, a name that meant nothing to most, but to those in the know was the leader of the city's underworld, a con artist, a bunco steerer, a green goodsman, and more than anything else, a rascal who knew how to play the game.
Together, they ran a series of schemes that ranged from card sharping to conning the wealthiest people in the city. And Edward? Well, he was an actor, a brilliant one at that. If he'd only used his talent for good, he could have made a name for himself. But instead, he played parts that were far more dangerous. Young Englishmen of title, simple country boys, and even a college undergraduate, all personas carefully crafted to fit whatever con they were running that week. And then came the ultimate disguise, one that sealed his fate. One day, Edward dressed as a girl, and he pulled it off, seamlessly. He became such a valuable asset to McCoy's operations that it became their go-to game. The whole city had their fingerprints all over it. They had connections in Tammany Hall and the police force, so it seemed like nothing could stop them. In those days, before the Lexo Commission, if you had the right people in your pocket, you could get away with almost anything. They could have gotten away with it. They could have continued running their schemes, conning people with cards and trickery in New York, and nothing would have stopped them. But that's when they made their mistake. They ventured up to Rochester, and that's when things went wrong. They forged a name on a check, and that was the moment the game changed. It was my brother, Edward, who did it, though everyone knew it was Sparrow McCoy pulling the strings behind the scenes. I bought up that check. It cost me a small fortune to do so, but I had no choice. I went to my brother and laid the check on the table, eyes cold, voice steady, and swore to him I would prosecute if he didn't clear out. At first, he laughed it off, thinking it was just another bluff. He said I couldn't do it. I wouldn't because I couldn't break our mother's heart. He knew that I loved her too much to ever let her know the truth. But I made him see it wasn't just about her anymore. I told him straight. Our mother's heart was already broken. And then I laid down the final word. I told him I'd rather see him behind bars in Rochester than holed up in a hotel in New York. He hesitated, but eventually my words cut through. He gave in, and he made me a promise. No more Sparrow McCoy. He'd leave New York, he'd go to Europe, he'd get a fresh start in an honest trade. That promise felt like a small victory, but I knew it was fragile. I had to make sure he followed through. I took him straight to an old family friend, Joe Wilson, an exporter of American watches and clocks, and I asked Joe to give Edward a job in London. Joe agreed, setting him up with an agency position, a modest salary, and a 15% commission. Edward, with his charm and his polished demeanor, won Joe over in no time. Within the week, he was on a ship to London, a case full of samples in hand, ready for a fresh start. For the first time in a long time, I thought maybe, just maybe, this was the turning point. Maybe this would give my brother the chance to settle down. I could see he was shaken by the check incident, and Mother's words had hit him hard. She had been the best of mothers to him despite everything. She had been his great advocate, and now she was his great sorrow. But still, Sparrow McCoy loomed large in the background. I knew this wouldn't be easy. I had a friend in the New York detective force, and through him I kept a constant watch on McCoy. I knew I was determined to break the connection between them. I knew that was the only way to save Edward from falling deeper into the abyss.
Within a fortnight of my brother's departure, I received news that Sparrow McCoy had booked a berth on the Etruria, heading for England. It hit me like a bolt of lightning. As if he had whispered it in my ear, I was certain that he was crossing the ocean to bring Edward back into his web of deceit. McCoy would stop at nothing to reclaim my brother, and I knew that if I didn't act, I'd lose him for good. In an instant, I made up my mind. I would follow them. I would go to England and confront McCoy head on. I knew it was a lost cause, that my efforts might be futile, but I couldn't sit idly by. It was my duty. The night before I left, we knelt together, my mother and I, in prayer, asking for strength and success. She gave me a small, precious keepsake, her father's testament, the one he had given her on their wedding day in the old country. It was a piece of our family's legacy, a piece of my father's love for her. She asked me to keep it close to my heart for protection on the journey ahead. On board the steamship, I found myself once again in close quarters with Sparrow McCoy. It was strange, being forced to share the same space with the very man I had sworn to defeat. I would take every opportunity to undermine his plans, starting with the very first night. I walked into the smoking room where McCoy sat at the head of a card table, surrounded by a handful of young men, all ripe for the picking. They were a group of eager, unsuspecting passengers, each with full purses and empty heads, making their way to Europe, ready to lose it all. McCoy had already begun his game, setting up for what promised to be a rich harvest. I couldn't let that happen. "Gentlemen," I called out, my voice cutting through the smoke-filled room, "are you aware of who you're playing with?" The room fell silent for a moment, and then McCoy's voice rang out, sharp and defensive. "What's that to you? Mind your own business," he spat, eyes narrowing. One of the men, clearly intrigued, asked, "Who is it anyway?" I stepped closer, not even sparing McCoy a glance. "He's Sparrow McCoy, the most notorious card sharper in the States." The room went cold. McCoy shot to his feet, his hand grabbing for a bottle, but then he stopped. For a moment, the realization hit him that he was no longer under the protection of Tammany. He was under the rule of the old country, where law and order meant something. Violence and murder didn't slip through the cracks. He glared at me, his fist clenched, but the threat was hollow. "Prove your words, you." I stood my ground, calm and steady. "I will," I said, locking eyes with him. "If you'll just turn up your right shirt sleeve to the shoulder, I'll either prove my words or I'll eat them." This was a pivotal moment, the first confrontation, the first real challenge. There was no going back now. I could feel the weight of it all, the tension rising in the room. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was a battle for my brother's soul.
He turned pale, white as a ghost, and not a word escaped his lips. But I knew his kind. I knew his tricks, the ones he used to deceive and cheat. What I had on him, what he didn't realize, was a piece of his own machinery, the sleight of hand he used to pull off his scams, an elastic strap running down his arm with a clip above the wrist. This was the secret mechanism that allowed him to pull cards from one sleeve and swap them for others hidden elsewhere. I'd figured it out, and I knew it would be there. It was.
He cursed me under his breath and slunk out of the saloon, avoiding me for the rest of the voyage. For once, I had finally gotten the better of Mr. Sparrow McCoy. But my victory was short-lived. McCoy got his revenge swiftly enough. When it came to Edward, my brother, McCoy had a grip on him that I couldn't break. Despite my best efforts, it seemed like I was losing the battle. For the first few weeks in London, Edward had kept himself together, sticking to his new job, working with the American watches. But that was before McCoy reappeared. It didn't take long for the old habits to resurface. McCoy's influence was like a storm. He weighed on Edward every time, pulling him back into a world of cards and schemes. Then the scandal broke. I read about it in the evening paper. A traveler, a businessman in Northumberland Avenue, had been fleeced by 2 card sharpers, McCoy's signature work. Scotland Yard was already involved. My heart sank. I knew that Edward was back to his old ways, caught in McCoy's net again. I rushed to Edward's lodgings. The landlady told me that he had left, gone with a tall gentleman. I didn't have to ask who that was. McCoy. And they were gone. Edward had packed his things, and the last thing she'd overheard was McCoy telling the cabman to take them to Euston Station, mentioning something about Manchester. I barely glanced at the clock. 5 o'clock seemed like the most likely departure time, though there was a 4:35 as well. I had just enough time to catch the later train, but when I arrived, there was no sign of them. Not at the depot, not on the train. They'd taken the earlier one. That's it. They were already gone. I had no choice but to follow them, to Manchester and to the hotels there. I couldn't let McCoy win. I would find them. I would stop him before it was too late. One final chance, one last appeal to my brother, to everything he owed to our mother. I thought maybe, just maybe, I could save him from the spiral he was caught in. My nerves were shot, taut like a wire, and I reached for a cigar to steady myself. Just as the train began to roll forward, the door to my compartment flung open. I jumped up, and there, standing on the platform, were McCoy and my brother, disguised. Both of them knew they were being hunted by the London police, and they weren't about to take any chances. McCoy, wearing a large astrakhan collar, had it drawn up so high that only his eyes and nose were visible. As for my brother, he was dressed as a woman. A black veil was pulled halfway down his face, but there was no mistaking it. I knew instantly who it was, even if I hadn't recognized the familiar signs. He had done this before, and I could see through the ruse immediately. I stood up, trying to rush to the door, but in that moment McCoy saw me. He said something under his breath, quick, sharp, and the conductor slammed the door shut just as the train pulled away.
I was too late. They had already been ushered into the next compartment, and the wheels of the train were already in motion. I couldn't stop them. When we stopped at Willesden, I wasted no time. I switched compartments immediately. I wasn't sure if anyone noticed me. Likely not, as the station was packed with people in the chaos of the stop. But McCoy knew. He had spent the time between Euston and Willesden carefully poisoning my brother's mind against me. The words he'd spoken, the things he'd said, were all designed to harden his heart, to turn him away from me. I could feel it when I tried to talk to Edward. He was different. cold, detached. He was no longer the brother I had tried so hard to save. I tried everything to reach him. I begged, I pleaded, I painted a picture of his future, a future rotting away in a British gale. I spoke of our mother's heartbreak, how she would fall apart if she knew what he was doing. But nothing worked. He just sat there, a fixed sneer on his face, and McCoy, that devil, would drop a taunt now and then. "Why don't you run a Sunday school?" McCoy would mock me, his voice dripping with disdain. Then, almost as if to keep Edward anchored in his new resolve, he added, "He thinks you're still a little boy. He thinks he can control you, pull you this way and that. He's just now learning that you're a man too." With each word, McCoy was tightening his grip on Edward. I could feel it. The further I tried to reach him, the further he slipped away. And there, in that moment, I realized I was no longer fighting just McCoy. I was fighting for my brother's very soul. "A man?" I snapped, my voice bitter. "Well, I'm glad to have your friend's word on that, because no one would ever guess it looking at you dressed like some boarding school girl. There's not a more pathetic sight than you sitting there wearing that ridiculous little pinafore." The words hit hard. I saw his face flush with shame. He was vain, and he couldn't bear the sting of ridicule. "It's just a dust cloak," he muttered, but his voice faltered. "Had to throw them off the scent. Couldn't think of another way." I watched as he quickly took off the cloak, then the toque with the veil still attached. He stuffed them both into his brown leather bag, his hands trembling. "Anyway," he said, trying to regain some dignity, "I won't need it until the conductor comes around." "No, you won't," I shot back, grabbing the bag with a sudden surge of frustration. I hurled it out the window, the bag disappearing into the darkness. "Now," I said, "you're not making a fool out of yourself while I'm around. If a cheap disguise is what's stopping you from ending up in jail, then you can go to jail." That was the turning point. I felt the shift, the change in momentum. For all his bravado, my brother was more fragile than I had ever realized. His pride had been cut by the harshness of my words. His face flushed again, but this time with shame, and his eyes brimmed with tears. But McCoy saw it too, and he wasn't about to let me press my advantage. "He's my partner," McCoy spat, "and you won't bully him." "He's my brother," I retorted, "and you won't ruin him. I'll see him behind bars if that's the only way to stop you both." McCoy's face twisted with rage. "You'd squeal, huh?" he sneered. In a flash, his hand moved to his coat, and I saw the glint of metal, a revolver. I reacted, rushing forward, but it was too late. He fired before I could reach him. The bullet, meant for me, missed. Instead, it tore through the chest of my brother. His body slumped, the life draining out of him as I watched in horror.
He fell, silent, without a single groan, right there on the floor of the compartment. McCoy and I, equally horrified, equally stunned, knelt beside him, both of us frantically trying to bring him back. But it was too late. His life had already drained away. McCoy still clutched the revolver in his hand, the same one that had just stolen my brother's life. But in that moment, all the anger, all the resentment between us was swallowed up by the tragedy that had just unfolded. It was McCoy who snapped first. His eyes flicked to the door. The train had slowed, almost to a crawl, and in an instant he saw his chance. The door flew open. I was as quick as he, though. I leapt at him, and the two of us went tumbling down the footboard, our bodies crashing together, rolling down the steep embankment. I hit my head hard against a stone. The world went black. When I came to, I was lying in some bushes, not far from the railroad tracks. My head throbbed like a drum, and someone was gently bathing my forehead with a wet handkerchief. It was him, Sparrow McCoy. "I guess I couldn't leave you," he said, his voice oddly calm.
I didn't want to have the blood of both of you on my hands today. You loved your brother, sure, but don't think you loved him more than I did. I might have taken a hell of a way to show it, but I loved him too. And now, well, it seems like a pretty empty world without him. I don't give a damn if you hand me over to the hangman or not." He had twisted his ankle in the fall, sitting there with his foot useless, while I just felt the pulsing pain in my head. We sat in silence for a while, exhausted, two men who had just seen everything unravel. Then, bit by bit, we started to talk, first in grumbles, then in longer sentences, until it became something more. My bitterness, that need for revenge, began to soften, little by little, until it shifted into something almost like sympathy. What good would come from punishing a man who had suffered just as much as I had? How could I make him pay when he was as broken as I was? And then, as my thoughts started to clear, something else came to me. Revenge. But what could I do against McCoy that wouldn't come back on me? How could I convict him and save face when doing so would drag my brother's entire life into the open? We couldn't risk that. We couldn't risk revealing everything, especially to Mother. In that moment, it became clear. This was no longer just about revenge or justice. What had begun as my pursuit of the truth had twisted until I found myself, reluctantly, an ally in the cover-up. As much as it was my duty to make McCoy pay, I had to admit we had as much to lose as he did. We stood amidst the sprawling pheasant preserves, the kind that dotted the English countryside, a familiar sight to anyone who'd spent time in the old country. But to me, in that moment, it felt more like a labyrinth, one I was trying to navigate while my every instinct told me to keep silent, to bury the truth. I didn't have to ask. McCoy knew exactly what I was thinking. He turned, his eyes heavy with understanding, and perhaps even some compassion. "Unless," he began, pausing for a moment, "unless there's something in your brother's pockets that we don't know about, there's no way they're going to figure it out. His ticket, that's in my pocket, and the baggage claim slip, same deal. He didn't travel like the others. He didn't have a full set of luggage with personal markings, just what he needed to pass as an ordinary man."
I knew he was right. My brother had always been impulsive, reckless. He'd bought a new wardrobe in London, new clothes without any labels. He'd cut all ties with the past, even his belongings, unmarked, untraceable. The bag with the dust cloak, the one I had tossed out of the window, might still be out there somewhere, hidden in a thicket, maybe lost to time. Or maybe it had found its way into the hands of a tramp, a scavenger, or worse, a police officer, who might have quietly filed it away. I had seen nothing about it in the papers, no mention, no follow-up. The police, too, had moved on. "The watches," I pressed, though I didn't need to. McCoy already knew what I was asking. "Business," he said flatly. "They were part of the shipment he was supposed to deliver. Might be he was taking them to Manchester, but—" His words trailed off, like he was dismissing the whole matter, too tired of the story to continue. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the mirror. I had forgotten about it. How could I? That small, seemingly innocuous thing tucked into my brother's pocket. A simple circular mirror, the kind you might carry around in a pocket for touch-ups. But there was something more to it, something that only a gambler would understand. McCoy's voice dropped lower, like he was telling me a secret. "You see, when you're sitting at a card table and you're playing your hand, a mirror like that, it lets you see what your opponent is holding. You just set it on your lap, keep it tilted the right way, and every card your opponent's dealt, you see it all, every move, every play." That was the key. The police would never have understood. How could they? But I knew what it meant. I understood now.
My brother wasn't just carrying watches, he was part of something far darker, something deeper, and I was now too deep in it to escape. It's one thing to see a man's hand, but it's quite another to know it. When you can read a player's every move down to the smallest card, there's no bluffing left. You don't just raise him, you control the game entirely. The mirror, the elastic clip, it's all part of the sharper's arsenal, just like Sparrow McCoy's arsenal of deceit. Had the police followed the trail from those high-end hotels, they could have unraveled the whole scheme. But then again, I doubt they would have ever seen it for what it truly was: mastery and manipulation, fraud hiding in plain sight. The rest of the story is easy enough to piece together. After the tragedy, we became just two more names in the crowd, two gentlemen on a walking tour, hiding our secrets under the weight of our falsehoods. We made our way through the night, first to Amersham, then quietly to London. From there, McCoy took his leave, bound for Cairo, and I returned to New York, as if nothing had happened at all. My mother, bless her heart, died 6 months later, never knowing the truth of what had transpired. She believed my brother was still trying to make an honest living in London. He had never written, so there was no change in her daily belief. I never had the heart to shatter her world, not even with the truth of what we had done, what had happened to Edward. Her deathbed was a quiet affair. The last name she spoke was his, the name of the son she had loved beyond reason, the son I had failed to protect. There's just one more thing I need to ask of you, as a small favor in return for my confession, if I can call it that. Remember that testament we found? It was always in my inside pocket, the family Bible, the one with my brother's name in it, alongside mine, marked by my father. It slipped out of my coat when I fell, and it means more to me than anything else. If you could help me, I would forever be in your debt. It's a small thing, but important. Just address it to X at Bassano's Library, Broadway, New York. I'm sure it will get to me, though it holds no value to anyone else.
And thus the story ended. If you liked this journey into the worlds of classic literature, do not forget to support us by subscribing so we can tell you more. And hey, if there's a classic tale you'd love to hear told in this suspenseful style, drop its name in the comments below. Your suggestion might be our next chilling adventure.